New York City's police union is blasting new proposed legislation that would make use of force by officers a last result, justifiable only after de-escalation, verbal warnings, and non-lethal options have been exhausted. The proposal by the state's attorney general would demand a higher standard of proof and no longer allow officers to justify their use of force based on suspicion of crime. The city's union says if this passes, quote, more cops and regular New Yorkers are going to get hurt. Tonight, in our ongoing series on policing in America, we're taking a closer look at legal protections for thousands of law enforcement officers in this country, and the case of a 70-year-old Vietnam veteran who says he was assaulted by police while entering a VA hospital back in 2016. He's now asking this U.S. Supreme Court to let him sue the officers for allegedly violating his civil rights, and in doing so, roll back decades of qualified immunity for cops. Will they take the case? Here's ABC's Devin Dwyer.
70-year-old Vietnam vet Jose Oliva knew the screening routine at El Paso's VA.
I went to the VA regularly 3-4 times out of the year.
Security camera footage showing him at the checkpoint on his way to the dentist in February 2016. A trip that quickly turned into a nightmare after an officer asked for his ID.
I told him my VA card, my ID is in the bin. And for whatever reasons, he did not like that answer.
The recording didn't capture what was said, but the exchange leading to a physical altercation.
This big guy grabbed my left hand, and with his two hands, he jerked my arm as high as he could. Almost simultaneously, as this guy was jerking my hand, he put a chokehold on my throat. Very hard, very hurtful. And I told him, I cannot breathe. Let me go. I cannot breathe.
The officers taking Oliva into custody and citing him with disorderly conduct, a charge that was later dismissed. Attorneys for the officers say they were neutralizing a threat.
You can't look at this one isolated incident in a vacuum. In 2015 in El Paso at the same facility, there was a shooting there.
Yeah, the video looks shocking, but then you have to think, they don't know if Mr. Oliva has dynamite strapped to his chest or he's got a .45 handgun that he's going to just start shooting people indiscriminately.
Oliva's attorneys say the use of force was excessive, permanently damaging his shoulder and injuring one of his ears and throat.
There's just no way any reasonable person can watch that video and think that there was any reason for those VA police to do what they did to Jose.
But a federal appeals court last year dismissed Oliva's case against the cops. Its decision citing a Supreme Court rule since 1971 that sharply limits the right of Americans to sue federal officers under the Constitution. And even if the suit could go forward, the court has also said officers may invoke qualified immunity, an extra protection against personal liability against constitutional violations in most cases, in place for more than 50 years.
Qualified immunity protects officers unless the plaintiff in the case can find a prior court decision with virtually identical facts, holding those facts and conduct unconstitutional.
So if you're a federal officer, I mean, this is like a double high bar.
It is a double high bar. It is a double protection.
Accountability for law enforcement, especially federal officers, is under intense scrutiny nationwide. After scenes like these during last summer's protests for racial justice involving legions of federal agents, many unidentified, performing policing functions normally left to state and local agencies.
Not only are there more agents and special agents and officers, but they are doing more in the way of policing than has typically been the case with regard to our historically very limited federal police apparatus.
20 years ago, there were 88,000 federal officers, most working on the border or in federal prisons. Today, they number more than 132,000. Congress granted those federal officers greater protection from civil lawsuits than their state and local counterparts.
That way they can do their job and not have to be second guessing. We don't want our frontline security officers having to make these type of legal decisions when they're in life or death situations or circumstances.
Critics say the data doesn't back up those claims.
I spent 5 years as a cop. I tend to trust generally in the professionalism of other officers, and I find it very infantilizing when someone says that concerns about possible prospective lawsuits, purely speculative lawsuits, are going to be so strong that those fears are going to keep an officer from doing their job. I just don't buy that.
This officer has threatened me.
For many victims of alleged police abuse, civil claims are the only avenue for justice, and qualified immunity is a major sticking point. A Reuters investigation found police won 43% of federal excessive force cases from 2014 to 2017, invoking qualified immunity. Over the next 3 years, it increased to 56%. A trend some say underscores the need for reform.
The Supreme Court talked about it as a good faith defense. If the officer believed that what they were doing was constitutional, that there should be some manner of protection. But the Supreme Court's desires to protect more and more officers has led them to create a standard that is more and more difficult to meet.
Negotiations in Congress over a sweeping bipartisan police reform bill in honor of George Floyd are now stalled over whether to eliminate qualified immunity.
There are big policy trade-offs when you have an immunity for government officials. If you look at the legislation that Congress is considering, some of it doesn't get rid of qualified immunity entirely. It narrows it. If it's a good faith mistake, we're not going to allow a plaintiff to recover money damages for that. There might be other mechanisms to punish the officer, but that won't be one of them.
More than 24 states are considering their own limits on legal immunity for cops, but Jose Oliva is hoping the Supreme Court will take his case and set a new national standard.
Qualified immunity is basically too broad. It's not specific.
A plea to the justices to expand the ability of Americans to bring claims against cops in federal court.
That doesn't mean that the cases will necessarily be resolved in favor of the plaintiffs or that the government agents will always be viewed as the bad guys. All it means is that we have a neutral process where the claims are fairly adjudicated and decided on their merits.
Fairness now in the spotlight at the Supreme Court, which could decide as soon as Monday on whether to take Oliva's case and a closer look at qualified immunity. For ABC News, I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington.